This presentation focuses on the disagreements between Churchill and Roosevelt regarding India, which marred their usually friendly correspondence in the early part of 1942. So I'm going to start with the deterioration of the Allies' military position at the start of 1942. Japan's rapid advance through the Far East from December 1941 exposed the vulnerability of the British Empire and prompted questions from Britain's American ally about its ability to defend India. On the 13th of April, the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau escaped from Brest on the north coast of France. 2 days later, the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore fell to the Japanese. The psychological impact of this can't really be overstated. Churchill called the surrender of 80,000 British troops to a smaller Japanese force the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. More importantly for this presentation, many thought that India would be the next to fall to the Japanese. While Churchill's leadership was never really in doubt at this time, this was a definite low point in his tenure as Prime Minister, leading his wife to call it the Valley of Humiliation. Not long into Churchill's tenure as Prime Minister, the August 1940 offer was given to the Indian nationalist leaders, which would have given them positions on the Viceroy's Executive Council. This was not accepted, and many thought that this would be the end of the Indian nationalist issue until the end of the war. However, the fall of Singapore made a new offer necessary to secure the cooperation in the war effort of the Indian population. Roosevelt had previously been inclined to stay out of matters relating to the British Empire, despite his strong anti-imperialist beliefs. However, groups within his administration, such as the Near Eastern Division of the State Department, thought that the Indian issue could be solved by US intervention. Their case was helped by the Japanese advance. Moreover, Roosevelt began to receive reports from the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, the predecessor of the CIA, which painted a chaotic picture of Indian internal politics. For example, William J. Donovan, the head of the OSS, stated that, "Because of the danger to us of the Indian Ocean going, we are interested in the fate of India and in what the Indians will do. It is, therefore, no longer merely a British domestic question. We have a stake in their actions." Betraying an almost arrogant belief in his ability to come to a solution where so many had failed before him, as well as a deep suspicion of Churchill's motivations, Roosevelt began to mention the Indian issue in his correspondence with Churchill. The so-called Cripps offer of March 1942 was born out of the necessity of reaching a solution with Indian nationalist leaders, as well as a desire to appease American public opinion. Stafford Cripps, who had just returned from his ambassadorship to the Soviet Union, was riding high in the British imagination as an advocate of aid to the Soviet Union and an early Second Front. Moreover, he had long championed the Indian nationalist cause, thereby making him popular with the leaders of the movement. For all these reasons, Cripps was the perfect choice to deliver a new offer to the nationalist leaders. The basic content of the offer was a formal promise of independence at the end of the war if the Indians cooperated with the war effort and accepted the status quo until the armistice. Cripps arrived in New Delhi on March the 23rd. His initial proposal was rejected by the nationalist leaders, with Gandhi famously calling it a post-dated check. There is a historical debate about whether an agreement was still possible at this time. The more recent scholarship suggests that the gulf between the two sides was too great to be bridged. Nevertheless, neither side wanted to fall out of favour in the eyes of the American public, and therefore both sides stayed at the negotiating table. After 2 weeks, no agreement had been reached. Roosevelt's decision to send a personal representative to India was a characteristic example of his use of envoys to advance his foreign policy objectives. This role had previously been taken up by Harry Hopkins in his meetings with Stalin and Churchill. Colonel Louis Johnson was sent as part of a US trade delegation that had been planned months before, so as to accommodate British sensitivities. However, upon arriving in India, and despite having no knowledge of Indian politics and no experience in diplomatic affairs, Johnson enthusiastically immersed himself in the negotiations extracting concessions from both sides in the hope of reaching an agreement. Agreement seemed close. However, the die-hard imperial viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, was strongly opposed to the Johnson Plan, which would see the post of Minister of Defence go to an Indian. A telegram from Linlithgow enraged the Prime Minister, who resented US interference in British imperial matters. Churchill angrily informed Cripps that Colonel Johnson is not President Roosevelt's representative, prompting Cripps to withdraw the Johnson Plan, which effectively ended the possibility of reaching an agreement. A dejected Johnson cabled US Secretary of State Hull that London wanted a Congress refusal. Roosevelt demonstrated his naivety regarding imperial issues in his April 11th telegram to Churchill. After admonishing the unwillingness of the British government to concede to the Indians the right of self-government, Roosevelt reiterated a suggestion that he had made to Churchill a month earlier, whereby the American Articles of Confederation are used as a model for India. Churchill's scathing treatment of this suggestion in his war memoirs demonstrates his covetousness over the British Empire. Historian David Reynolds places Roosevelt's intervention within a wider context of Roosevelt's growing assertiveness in his foreign policy. Reynolds highlights three initiatives: intervention in India, entering the British-Soviet debate about post-war borders, and pushing for an early second front. My source is Churchill's unsent reply to Roosevelt, which demonstrates Churchill's unyielding commitment to the British Empire. His first point, which outlines the British minority issue, was often raised by imperial diehards to justify the maintenance of the empire. Moreover, Churchill stated that he was loath to be influenced by United States public opinion in a matter which concerns the British Empire and is vital to our successful conduct of the war in the East. The most striking aspect of this source is that Churchill makes a veiled threat to resign if Roosevelt insists on reopening the Indian constitutional issue, though he is no doubt aware that Roosevelt would not risk such a serious public divergence between the British and United States governments. The 1942 crisis over India was a sideshow in Anglo-American relations. However, this source is valuable because it shows that there were sometimes severe disagreements between the two leaders, born out of deeply held beliefs. Moreover, the British Empire was not the only cause of tensions between the Allies, as disputes over a second front were soon to show.